Loretta Lynn rose to musical fame through songs such as Coal Miner's Daughter, Trouble in Paradise, and The Pill. But have you ever wondered how her Kentucky roots influenced her lyrics? Join us today for a discussion with a former research fellow who explores how Lynn's upbringing in Johnson County indelibly shaped her artistic output, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the Associate Editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, a scholarly journal and publication since 1903. I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which supports researcher visits to our campus from around the world. Kentucky Chronicles is inspired by the work of researchers from across the world who have conducted research at the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Brian Ward is a professor in American Studies at Northumbria University. His previously published books include Just My Soul Responding, Rhythm and Blues, Black Consciousness and Race Relations, Media Culture and the Modern African American Freedom Struggle, Radio and the Struggle for Civil Rights in the South, and A&R Pioneers, the Architects of American Roots Music on Record. He's here today to talk about his article in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society entitled Sex, Drugs, and Country Music, Loretta Lynn, Gender Politics, and the Health Environment in Mid-20th Century Rural Kentucky. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I always enjoy asking about the origin stories for projects. So can you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in writing about Loretta Lynn? Did you enjoy listening to her music before, or what sort of piqued your interest to settle in this particular project?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say I've always been a fan, but perhaps not a super fan. And I realize that this is going out to an audience where there may be a forensic knowledge of Loretta Lynn's back catalogue and family arrangements. But I've been a fan. I'm of a generation where actually it was people like Elvis Costello, a much more recent artist, who just rhapsodized about Loretta Lynn as a songwriter. And, for someone who came out of a sort of punk background, that was the conduit into thinking more seriously about country music. And, she was revered by so many people that I really liked that ultimately, I felt obliged to pay due attention to her. And that admiration has really just blossomed over the years. And, irrespective of how much scholarly work I do on Loretta Lynn, at some fundamental level, I really enjoy her music and I think she's a prodigious talent.
No, I always like asking that question because I always find it interesting with biographies, but also with people dealing with subjects. Do you enjoy it? Is it someone you're interested in? And I've always found it must be difficult if you're writing about someone you don't really like. When you read some biographies and you're like, oh, you can tell that that's a difficult one. But for this, I'd imagine that it's a little easier.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I've written on rhythm and blues music. I've written on British beat music. I've written on, any number of genres. And it would be wrong of me to suggest that I prefer, on a personal level, some more than the others. They're all kind of rewarding to probe and try to see what they can offer in terms of a lens on, contemporary American or British society. So, that's my intellectual engagement with it. And I don't always have to like the music particularly. I must say that when it comes to Loretta Lynn, both boxes are ticked.
So as you mentioned, I'd imagine that most of our listeners are familiar with Loretta Lynn. But let's say for a second that someone's not, so that you can set up this article just a little bit. Could you give us a little bit about her background? Where did she grow up? What types of things does she sing about?
Yeah, I mean, she's born in the heart of the Depression, 1935, in eastern Kentucky, in Johnson County, in Van Lear, or Butcher Holler, adjacent to Van Lear. It's a traditional sort of coal town. It's owned essentially by Consolidated Coal, and so she grows up in very humble circumstances. She's one of many kids, and money's tight for everyone, and tighter still because she's living through the Depression. And I think, that in a way, what the article talks about is how that legacy of growing up impoverished, but also with ill health and poor medical care all around, leaves a permanent marker on her as an individual and as an artist. And it's not just the songs, it's, she produces a lot of kind of memoirs of one sort or another. be it cookery books or, Coal Miner's Daughter and Still a Woman. There's some more formal memoirs. She writes a lot about her life and how she got to the place where she is as essentially a superstar. And throughout all of that, that sort of echo, that memory of growing up in Eastern Kentucky is really a live part of her existence, and that I find really fascinating. So you asked, what does Loretta Lynn sing about? I could flip that and say, what doesn't she sing about? There's all the stuff you would expect about love, loss, lust, passions, disappointments, longings, hopes, aspirations. Everything that popular music takes care of. But within that sort of broad spectrum of writing, the thing that I thought had been under-recognized and that I was most interested in sort of exploring was the importance of what I call the health environment. And that would include good health, bad health, multiple diseases, infirmities, maladies, doctors, nurses, hospitals, and once you start looking for it, you suddenly think to yourself, God, did she write about anything else? You go full circle. So, she's a prodigious talent, as I've mentioned, and she covers the whole gamut of human experience. But what I was most interested for this particular piece of work was in the health-related stuff.
I had not realized until I was reading your article the sheer amount of not just musical material that she produced, but as you mentioned, I was astounded by the cookbooks, the memoirs, however mediated it was through different authors or different sort of audiences that she's looking for. That was fascinating to me. That she's almost constantly, I don't want to say interpreting her own life, but she's sort of going to her own backstory constantly.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it was a shock to me. I knew about Coal Miner's Daughter, that memoir, because it was gargantuan and became the film. And, that's sort of a kind of part of the public understanding of Loretta Lynn. But then, during the course of the research, which may be an indictment of how slowly I work, other things kept coming out. Only a few years before she passed, there's a book called Me and Patsy about her relationship with Patsy Cline, who she adored and who adored her, and who was very formative on her understandings of a woman's role in the country music business, and just sort of, I think, gave her a sense of independence that she was striving for. So there are essentially 5 memoirs of one sort or another, and even the cookbook is an extraordinary kind of, text. In that, there are some great recipes, and you kind of want to try them, but they're always tethered to anecdotes about where she got this recipe, about her life, as a housewife, as a cook, and the influences upon her. So they're kind of really rich as another sort of portal into Loretta Lynn's life. And again, there's all kind of, if you start thinking about it, there's all kind of health implications, dietary implications, embedded in those cookbooks.
Is there one specific example you could give our listeners of how sort of that Kentucky influence maybe came through in a song or influenced something that she wrote? Is there something, I know there's a lot of examples that you could give, and you give a lot in the article, but is there one in particular that either stood out or that you feel like, oh, this one really shows that sort of Kentucky influence?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to take it a step further back in that, one of the things that I was talking about in the article was the dearth of good family planning advice, contraception, female reproductive health information and care. And, that is an empirically sort of provable phenomenon in Kentucky in the mid-20th century, in the era that she grows up in. So then when she takes this quite bold step to record a song called The Pill, so bold, in fact, that her company won't release it for 2 or 3 years until they're sure that actually it's not going to alienate, that it's going to actually secure more money than it is going to alienate listeners. That kind of sort of moment where she's singing about the pill and about what contraception can do for women in her situation, is clearly, I think, rooted in her own upbringing, in her own experience of multiple pregnancies, very young, and a kind of desire to take, greater control over her reproductive health. that was not available to women of her generation and her class in Kentucky, or perhaps across the South Bank, maybe across America during that period. So in a way, that's, it's not absolutely just about Kentucky, but it's about East Kentucky's experiences of certain phenomena to do with women's reproductive health. And so I think that's where you can see that childhood influence playing out in her choice of songs to sing and the way that she presents herself.
It gives you a lot to think about. Sometimes you listen to music and you go, it's just a song. And then you read an article and you go, wait, it's so much more than that, in so many different levels. And I think especially for the context, I know for people who might not be familiar with her music, just realizing how much those songs, they were bold in their day, and that, it really was something that sort of you just didn't talk about.
Yeah, I mean, the other, I guess, one of the other main strands in the piece is the way that she deals with her husband's alcoholism, and deals with it as an addiction. And she goes through various phases of denial and grudging acceptance, and then sort of, by the end of her life, he was an alcoholic, and that was really problematic. But you sort of tether that to her experiences growing up among drinking men in Eastern Kentucky, where there was a certain, legitimization of that kind of drinking culture, and it comes with all kinds of, subtext of domestic violence and other kinds of, antisocial behavior as well. And you can see in a succession of songs and her life writings, her trying to process that she's come from this environment, a very kind of toxic environment, a very judgmental environment where, the drunks were, if they were men, often excused for just living, male lifestyles. If they were women who had problems with alcohol, that was considered much more morally suspect. Her trying to process that through her writing, through her songs, I think is absolutely fascinating. She's incredibly sort of brave, in taking that head on, even before she's fully digested it. And it's so close to home. It's her husband.
And that leads really nicely into the quote that I wrote down, because I really enjoyed the conclusion of your article, where you noted, Loretta Lynn's songs, recordings, and life writings stand as testimonies, not simple or unmediated ones to be sure, but powerful testimonies nonetheless, to her experiences of and responses to various health issues, many of which she processed with reference to her roots in Johnson County. So do you think that readers will approach Lynn's creative output differently after reading this essay, or what do you hope readers will walk away? I know for me personally, I will say that it did change completely how I listen to the music. It's a different, because I didn't think about those things before.
Well, that's very kind. I guess I tick one person off as having sort of made an impact on, and that's great. Then, my sense is that the way in which it's about Loretta Lynn. The way she's been looked at and talked about by critics and scholars in the past have emphasized her regional roots. That's right. They've emphasized her gender. She's a woman. She's, straight. So her sexuality and her navigation of that sort of part of her life, they've dealt with that. It certainly dealt with class. She comes from humble background that she's always keen to acknowledge, even when she's, incredibly wealthy. So basically what I was trying to think was, what would happen if you folded in one more kind of analytical lens? So that's a dreadful mixed metaphor, but if you used one more analytical lens, and it's not to the exclusion of all those other things that we already know are important about Loretta Lynn, it's to say that actually all those other factors flow through her understanding of health and her experiences of health. The healthcare she enjoyed and didn't enjoy were different because she was a white woman, living in a certain part of the world, from a certain class background. It's to try to complicate the story in ways that actually illuminate why she was preoccupied with some of the things she was preoccupied with. And as I say, it's, I've given sort of talks on this, and sometimes people say, are you saying like this is more important than race or class or gender or sexuality? And it's utterly compatible. And intricately interwoven with all those other things. It's just no one has yet bothered to tease out that particular strain. And I do think it adds, and I guess this is what, as historians we drive for, explanatory power, because it helps to explain a certain fixation that, and I swear to, you and listeners, if you start reading Loretta Lynn's stuff and listening to her songs, once you start thinking about health issues, you think to yourself, this place is saturated with references, allusions, and meditations on health and well-being.
I think it opens a lot of doors too, because as I was thinking about it, I go, okay, what other music am I consuming that you don't notice that those issues are being talked about in certain eras? Or, I think that medical lens does enable you to think, okay, even if you don't happen to be a fan of Loretta Lynn or you don't listen to a lot, I think if you read that article and go, oh, I could apply this to so many different musicians, or it's a really helpful tool, I think.
Well, that's interesting, because it's really the Loretta Lynn research is a slither of a bigger project, which is, I can never work out whether I want to write a musical history of Southern medicine or a medical history of Southern music. But I have a title for it, Rockin' Pneumonia and Boogie Woogie Flu, and then I'll flip. It'll either be a medical history of Southern music or a musical history of Southern medicine. Because actually, I think this does have explanatory power across genres and across time as well. Because of the nature of the South and its, peculiar, if not unique, health challenges, and also its reputation as a land where you can go to be, refreshed and rejuvenated. There's a kind of upside to Southern living that is supposed to be, health giving, not health taking. Because it's so ubiquitous, it strikes me that it would be foolish not to think about, well, what implications did that have for Southern music making? Mm-hmm. And once you start looking, it's everywhere. From, sort of like songs about black lung and, various ailments, pellagra, and, things like that, hookworm. There are blues about all of these things, yeah? Once you start looking for the sort of the signs and traces of a preoccupation with health, ill health, medical practice, it's everywhere. It's called the blues. It's like it's a genre that, among the many other things it does, contemplates depression. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a really rich topic way beyond Loretta Lynn. But I'll be forever grateful for her providing the first opportunity to do some in-depth work on it.
I think even with the music coming out of the South, it's still so universally applicable. I know for those of us who have relatives or maybe ancestors who are in the coal mines, I think any time you're touching on that, I mean, I have a lot of, ancestors who came from Pennsylvania. They were coal miners. So, I mean, it's not regional so much as you still have those same issues. And I think those health issues speak across a lot of people.
Well, you think about the Southern musical diaspora, the way that music that one could perhaps root in, of Southern origins, but that has actually, become instrumental, in fact, a dominant force in Western music, not just, the music of the United States, but across the Atlantic world. It's the richness of that music in terms of speaking to universal concerns that explains why it's become so popular. And I think you're absolutely right, although there'll be some specific stuff that is peculiar to the region. The notion that we all live, suffer, die, try to get well, that's kind of a universal thing that the music that deals with in a way that's actually very uplifting and joyous as well as sobering at times.
Which leads into sort of a fun question, I think. When you're writing an article, and we like to talk to our guests on Kentucky Chronicles about sources and how they sort of go about this process, it's a little different, I'd imagine, when you're looking at a musician. And I know you have a lot of experience with this, but do you listen to just a lot of music with the idea in your head of this is what I want to do? Are you just listening and the song lyrics kind of point you in a direction? Can you take us through sort of that process? Because I think you're one of the first guests we've had who really deals really specifically with music. How does that process sort of unfold for you, or how do you use that as a source?
So it's a good question and somewhat inscrutable in terms of process. Exactly how things work. Like most things in life, it's a mixture of very careful strategic planning and dumb luck. So I like music. I listen to a lot of music. I don't necessarily feel compelled to write what passes for historical scholarship on lots of the music that I write. But I guess I have trained myself to be listening for cues and clues about the social meaning of popular music more generally. And the Loretta Lynn piece, as indeed most of this bigger project on Southern music and health, is heavily based on the lyrics. It's people tell you what they're thinking, and tell you what they're feeling in quite explicit ways, which is odd given that when I teach this stuff, I spend a lot of my time telling students, please listen to the sound. There's a sort of politics and a meaning embedded in the very sound of the music, irrespective of whether there's any lyrics, which is why, jazz scholars, who often are working with instrumentals without any lyrics are driven by different kinds of agendas to tease the meaning out, which is a long way around of sort of saying, so yeah, I listen to a lot of stuff, and having caught a glimpse of this medical health sort of agenda, I guess I am attuned to particularly picking out those themes across all kinds of music, and not just American, not just roots music. I got listening to top 40 stations now, desperately trying to hear who's singing about what kind of medicine or illegal drugs or whatever. Just suddenly you're just sensitized to different things. So it is a mixture of serendipity and planning.
Do your students know who Loretta Lynn is? Like when you talk
to
them?
They do now.
Okay.
That's a really good question. So I teach U.S. history, American studies, usually from a multidisciplinary perspective. I work a lot of my scholarship has been on the African American freedom struggle. So these are the sorts of areas I work in. And there's music in every class, no matter how I cut and dice it. There's music in every class. Last year, and this may be of interest and maybe even a legacy of the Kentucky Historical Society, last year we had 3 whole sessions, so 3 weeks of work on Appalachia, Appalachia, which was the first session. We're just trying to work out how we would respectfully pronounce it.
We get those debates still.
And the students, they come from the northeast of England, a mining part of the world. It's built on coal. So they saw definite affinities with the region that they were studying, and I said we could use Loretta Lynn as a vehicle for this. And 2 or 3 had seen Coal Miner's Daughter, and these are 18, 19, 20-year-olds. None of them, I think, had any recollection of any of her songs. None of them had read the autobiography. So we gave them little bits and pieces, chunks of the writing, a few songs on a Spotify playlist, and they started, and like 2 or 3 of them, when they came to do their final essays, they didn't want to work on Loretta Lynn, but they were kind of interested in, the people, who did country music before the country music they're aware of now. Let's put it that way. Dolly Parton looms large in everyone's life, but they hadn't even really got song recognition for her. By the end of the semester, they had a really nice piece on Skeeter Davis, who, a good Kentucky woman, because someone had got interested in Skeeter Davis. And so it's a catalyst for expanding the knowledge. But, to be very blunt, I don't think any of them really were coming to do this course hoping for Loretta Lynn, but having encountered her, as a vehicle for thinking about lots of things to do with Kentucky in particular, but Appalachia more general, she's just really great teaching tool as well as being an interesting artist.
Yeah, I always would imagine, especially with music, styles change so quickly, and as well as what the younger generation picks up is always so different. I mean, even if you're doing country music, as you mentioned, what someone listens to today and what they consider is going to be just so completely different.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of them there whose gateway to country music is going to be Lil Nas X or Beyonce.
Yes.
And that's great because it does mean that, you can talk to them about the progenitors and the roots and all that kind of stuff and how transgressive it might be, in some ways for a black artist to be doing country music. And then you point out that country music is predicated on many African-American influences, and there have always been African-Americans involved in country music. So, it's another way of dismantling some myths about the South.
Which we always enjoy when scholars can help us do, because, as you know, with the South, Appalachia as well, there's a lot of myths out there. So I went back. You received a fellowship in spring 2018 at KHS. I'd like to ask this question of fellows who either aren't from Kentucky or who visited for a short time. I know this requires us to go a little bit back in time, but from your time in Kentucky, was there a favorite thing you did? It can be a source, anything that you sort of did on that research trip that you just enjoyed about Kentucky or that you sort of came to appreciate about the state?
I mean, that fellowship was indispensable to the work that I'm doing, and, hopefully is a stepping stone, not just to this article, but to this bigger project. And so I'll be eternally grateful. I'd never been to Frankfurt before. I'd been to Louisville on a couple of occasions. But this was my first sort of full immersion. And, in all honesty, as I was sort of thinking about, what did I really get out of that visit? It's definitely, sort of compartmentalized. So, I walked to the Buffalo Trace Distillery.
Yes.
And, I got that out of the trip. And, I drank some very fine bourbon, and I had some good beer, and I had some great fellowship, and that's important, sort of, you're on your own for 3 or 4 weeks in a strange land, and so it was a wonderful experience. In terms of the archival resources, at the Historical Society, even the sort of the clippings files, which is have been collated over the years, to be able to look at things about Loretta Lynn from the local press, to be able to look at things, gazetteers of Johnson County, to get a real feel for the social and demographic and political environment and economic environment in which she grew up. That's kind of indispensable. But then there's the sort of the next layer down, which is the sort of the various archival collections. There's family planning in Kentucky collection. There's patterns in parenting, oral history collection. For the things, once I got my teeth into the project, I knew I wanted to look at family planning and reproductive rights and all that. They're just incredibly rich resources there. So, I think what it did was it enabled me to back up a hunch. I thought this stuff was connected, and actually the resources that I found provided the more medical analogy, the connective tissue, to actually weave together an argument that I think holds water, and I think is potentially quite productive for thinking about music and popular culture in other places.
I'd love to hear that. And I think it's really good. I know we're sort of familiar with the process, but what I've really hoped to do with the podcast, and I think what we've been doing more and more, is showing people sort of how if you follow those hunches, they can really lead to good places, and that you don't really go into the archive always thinking to yourself, I've got this sort of fully formed idea, and this is exactly how things are going to work out, or sometimes it is just that hunch, and you go there, and having a place like KHS where you can get at some of those sources can help you go, okay, here's this story, it hasn't been told, but here's how we can tell it a little differently.
And I think some things that I thought wouldn't be that big a deal, the sources made me think, I need to put more emphasis on this, that. Other things perhaps receded. It's a reciprocal process between, your own sort of working through the material and what is emerging from the archive. And I think, That means that the project kind of morphs and transforms over time, and that's kind of okay as long as you go with the flow. And I think, perhaps in our current political moment, the fact that, these hunches work better if you've got some evidence and facts and, that something is verifiable, is kind of a good thing rather than literally just being a hunch or a gut feeling. I think that's one of the things that, historians do.
And it's a process. I always tell people, it's not like this happens in a day or a week or a month or a year. Articles take time. I mean, we're excited about your book project as well, but these things take time. And so even with the article, I mean, there's a lot of research that goes into that.
Yeah. I mean, nothing gets done overnight. And I think you do have to be sort of simultaneously flexible and hard-skinned. Some of your ideas aren't going to fly because there's no evidence. And rather than just pretending, you then have to modify your models and think again. So I think there's a degree of nimbleness, I guess, in the exchange with the archive and with editors and all those sort of other folks who ultimately sort of help generate what becomes the finished article.
I think that's a good way to end it. So thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your article.
Not at all, my pleasure. And, many thanks to everyone at KHS for their support from, I would say, cradle to grave, but while this project's been gestating and now coming to fruition.
Loretta Lynn passed away in October of 2022. Yet her story, as expressed in her life, books, and music, will continue to reverberate. As Dr. Ward taught us today, focusing on her music and books can shed a great deal of light on the medical challenges that rural women faced. As time passes, we hope that scholars will continue to turn to Lynn's music and books to understand her remarkable life and to help us understand the changes that took place in the lives of women in the 20th century. This brings another episode to a close. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Brian Ward, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov.